Okay, good to go. Okay, well, hello everyone, and welcome to Slipping Through the Cracks, Racism and the Struggle for Equity in the Field of Conservation. My name is Rubai Aurora, and I'm the Public Affairs and Community Engagement Manager at Woodland Park Zoo. This event is co-hosted by Woodland Park Zoo's Young Philanthropist Network, Network for Nature, and the University of Washington's College of the Environment and EarthLab. You can learn more about these programs through links in the chat. A couple housekeeping notes. Video controls and caption settings are at the bottom of your screen. For questions, please use the Q&A box and feel free to use the chat box to chat with one another. Molly Fox, who manages Network for Nature, will be monitoring the chat. A special thanks to Molly and UW's Isabel Carrera Zamanillo, Constance McBaron, Lindsay Heaney for organizing this event. Thank you. So our goal today is to discuss the consequences of racism in the field of conservation. So we're not here to debate whether or not racism exists in conservation. It does, and has a very real impact, especially on BIPOC communities. So I'll ask a couple questions to the panelists, giving everyone a chance to respond. And then at 6:40, we'll pause for a special guest for about 10 minutes, then come back to the audience questions with the time we have left. So before I introduce our panelists, we want to include a land acknowledgement to honor the Indigenous people of the land on which we work and live. The host and organizers of the event recognize that we are on the land of many Indigenous communities. The University of Washington and Woodland Park Zoo honor the Coast Salish people of this land and the land which touches the waters of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. Okay, so let's begin with an introduction to our panel. Chris Schell is an ecologist and professor at the University of Washington, Tacoma. Cassie Whitebread is an educator and program manager at Seattle Works. Jasmine Ramgotra is an artist and founder of Culture Shift, and also an environmental studies student at UW. Latasha Trice is a senior program manager at Seattle Works with an extensive background in social and human services. Erin Soto Carlin is an anthropologist and a filmmaker focused on environmental justice. And Ursula Valdez is a lecturer at UW Bothell on many topics, including conservation and the human connections to the environment. Thank you so much for being here. So I want to begin the discussion by going around the room to get an understanding of the racist policies and practices you've seen in your work, either locally or abroad, and the effect they have on BIPOC communities. So to keep this flowing, I can call out a few speakers and as I see them on my screen. So how about Ursula, would you like to start?
Sure, thank you. Hi, Rubai, and thanks for hosting this. Well, I think for me, it comes from multiple dimensions. I'm privileged in a certain way to be from different cultures. I'm originally Peruvian, and I have been, I grew up in lands of, actually, I should recognize the lands that I grew up. I grew up in Quechua lands, Quechua people, and I have the fortunate opportunity to work in Amazonian communities such as the Machigenga and the Eseja communities land. One of the things I've seen is that, we live in a problem of perpetuated misconceptions about people all over the world. And I think that I can relate a lot for that. Not only, personally, but mainly for the people that I work and that I have been able to interact with. So we have in particular a lot of problems with Indigenous people that are not recognized on the actual incredible value of their knowledge and their traditional practices in conservation that, when we either, me as a Peruvian from a city or with education or people from other places come to a place to trying to teach how to conserve the forest. So I work in particular in Amazonian rainforest, and for a long time, which not to take the value of people being interested in conservation, being interested in protecting rainforests with all the good intentions. But I think like many times we bring into this like a kind of lack of acknowledgement that people have been there for like centuries, if not longer times, and they knew how to do things. So the value of traditional knowledge, the value of actually a lot of scientific knowledge that probably was documented in different ways, and then being able to bring them into this platform has been a little bit problematic. Another thing that I think is pretty important, particularly for me, that is that the role of women in conservation. I've seen a lot of disparities, and I have suffered myself disparities on being recognized just by being a woman in the field. And then how that has affected a lot. I mean, when I was very young, it contributed to my insecurity. And it took me a lot of, obviously, I'm fortunate that I have a family that instilled in me that push, that willing to kind of, okay, don't worry, you can do this, right? And educators and mentors to help me. But I see a lot of like how the role of women is in many cases disregarded. And if we look at even the evolutionary history of how women needed to know a lot about resources, so then it could collect resources, it could bring those to feed their families and so on. And it's a very important role. So I've been very impacted by seeing that most of the times. I have to recognize that personally, the struggle maybe haven't been too hard when it comes to racism, but my community and many communities around us have a struggle, and that is obviously, as you say, is undeniable. So I'll stop in there and I'll give the opportunity to other people to continue.
Great, thank you so much. I especially am very interested in that point on how women get disregarded in the conversation. Right. That's great, thank you. Jasmine, how about you? Would you like to give your insight?
I would love to. I've just been writing furiously over here is something that I do often. I've been focusing on writing a curriculum that's about specifically intersectionality and how essential the understanding of intersectionality is to addressing climate change and seeing the connectedness between racism and other systemic oppressions. But I'm coming today with to be completely honest, a lot of rage in my heart right now. And it's because the mainstream environmental movement, the conservation movement, has been built from a place of white supremacy and also the separation of human from nature. For example, John Muir, who's thought to be the founder of our national parks, the father of our national parks, was a blatant racist towards the indigenous peoples and wrote horrifying things about them in his journals, and in which he's glorifying the environment from which these people live and thrive and are completely and totally interconnected with. And then it's oh, but we're different and we're separate. So this idea of separation is kind of where it all sort of began. And that's still where we're at. And so when it comes to people of color representing environmental organizations and also being adversely affected by environmental harms, environmental racism, we're seeing a lot of tokenization and not having people's voices heard within these organizations because there's a hierarchy and there's not enough people of color in leadership positions. And so what we're seeing is white saviorism, tokenism, and trying to break this green ceiling, which is really challenging, and it needs to happen as soon as possible because we're in so many states of crisis.
That's an excellent point. Thank you, Jasmine. Yeah, I think it's really is interesting how awkward or difficult it is for a person of color to be in this field. Aaron, would you like to give your answer?
Sure, thank you, Rubai, and thank you for sharing Ursula and Jasmine's really moving and inspiring. My views and experiences or observations are coming from work in the environmental conservation space from 2009 to about 2016, mostly in Mexico, and a real deep dive into how indigenous and local communities were treated, usually not engaged, oftentimes whose rights were very violently violated. Yeah, so the deepest dive I did into a major exclusion of indigenous and local communities from conservation activities looks at a really emblematic case in the Lacandon jungle in Chiapas, which was made famous for the Zapatista uprising in 1994. And I spent a lot of time with communities of many different groups, Tzotzil, Saltal, Chol, and others in that area, who were told by the Mexican government in the 50s to go out and settle this land. Now, the government referred to it as a desert of solitude. This is a forgotten place, super hot, lots of bugs, absolutely no public services, water, electricity, waste management, schools, healthcare, nothing. And then 15 years later, in 1979, with zero consultation with local populations, the federal government declares a protected area. And I think something on the order of 150,000 local indigenous community members are now technically illegal, or they're no longer allowed to live and practice basic livelihoods, grazing cows or having pigs or growing corn, beans, squash on this land. And what I was a part of for supporting as a advocate, as a storyteller, as oftentimes a kind of union, the representative, was the continued fight of these groups of communities that were referred to as illegal settlers by the government. Their efforts to gain land tenure, their efforts to articulate their right to be there and to have, like Ursula said, their traditional knowledge recognized, their ability to really uniquely and effectively manage the local environment, producing while growing their livelihood and preserving the environment. So real extreme case of exclusion and violence against local indigenous communities, completely excluded from the conservation process in a scenario where, from my point of view, their knowledge and skills are absolutely the best solution for conserving the environment in a way that's both economical and effective. So that's what I'll share, and I'll stop for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. Now that's surprising how basic involvement or consultation or even just talking to a community is the last thing when it comes to certain policies and things that are made. Cassie, would you like to share a little?
Thanks, Rubai, and thank you everybody for your contributions so far. As Rubai mentioned, my background is in education. Jasmine, you kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of, being tokenized within the environmental education realm was my main experience. More often than not, I was one of very few BIPOC educators teaching, majority or if not 100% white students. So there's definitely some barriers in terms of access to getting into those natural spaces. My other experience has been within the environmental nonprofit sector, where, again, one of very few BIPOC staff, very low rung on the ladder, had a lot of, barriers that I faced in terms of trying so desperately hard to get my superiors to understand how important it was to do the work that we were doing through an anti-racist lens, especially when in certain locations at this organization, we were mainly working with BIPOC communities. And so I, time after time saw, this historically and currently white-led environmental nonprofit go into spaces where there was so much knowledge, so many funds of knowledge in terms of how to use the land to grow food, and came in with this kind of white savior complex of like, let's teach you because we are the experts, because we have this title. Whereas, you know, we should have been asking them, you know, what can you bring to the table? What do you already know? How can we, you know, share within this community gathering what the practices are?
Yeah, that's also an excellent point. And actually, I'd love to, when we're done with these rounds, come back to the topic of what it's like to be one of very few people of color or BIPOC people in the place of work that you are, or even your education setting. So thanks, Cassie. Chris?
Sure. I want to just thank and express my deepest gratitude to everybody that's had a chance to speak so far. Y'all are awesome. This panel is amazing. And thanks to Woodland Park Zoo and UW College of the Environment, as well as EarthLab. It should be noted that I think conservation as its foundation, when it was built on the backs of Black and brown bodies, and the labor at which has been stolen from stolen people on stolen lands has perpetuated this idea that Jasmine and Ursula and Aaron and Cassie had already talked about, the fact that things need to be separate. That separatist movement, that separatist ideology itself is based in and rooted in white supremacy. And I have a really good friend who, sociologist, and very much described the power of white supremacy as a strategy where it exerts itself everywhere and then erases itself to seem like it's nowhere. So that way it's the status quo. So what does that mean for conservation? Well, essentially what that means is that when we implement the science, we think that there's no bias. We think that we're being objective. We think that we're making recommendations. Those recommendations are made on the betterment of the animals, of the flora, of the fauna, of our planet. And the reality is, as Cassie had pointed out, the majority of folks that are coming into our doors when they come into conservation and environmental science programs are majority white, because we over centuries have either de facto or government sanctioned put together policies that have said that you're Black, you don't belong in this green space. And that's been perpetuated up to this day. And it should be noted, as we're doing this panel in the context of Jacob Blake being shot in the back 7 times while trying to break up a fight in the middle of his kids. His kids will be traumatized forever. I have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old son, and I think about this constantly in the way in which I do my work. And this has to stop, because we're not just killing our people. We're not just killing our brothers. We're killing our planet when we do this harm in ways that conservation in its traditional sense will never heal, ever. So thinking about the ways in which we implement people of different faiths, communities, understanding and valuing traditional ecological knowledge in ways that hasn't been done before, it's about damn time.
Thank you, Chris, for those very powerful words. And I think the point you made about how conservation and science tries to separate itself from even acknowledging race or acknowledging the people that are a part of it is a really important reason why it's very racist and very difficult for people of color to work in that space. Thank you. Latasha.
Thank you, Rubai, and Chris, I mean, thank you for sharing, very powerful, and to all of you for sharing just your experiences. I'm so humbled to be on this panel today. I don't necessarily work in the conservation field. I'm just, you know, a girl who loves to be outdoors, and working at Seattle Works, I've helped plan many, many volunteer projects. You know, I'm not gonna name drop any nonprofit partners, but, you know, pretty predominantly white led. And you know, I was so excited. I have an 8-year-old son, you know, and I said, I'm gonna get my Black boy some joy. We're gonna go outside. We're gonna go outdoors to escape racism, to be free. You know, I don't feel like the outdoors are colonized, so why should we fear? But lo and behold, we should, and we do. And we go out there and we're being looked at as if we don't belong He's being kind of nagged on by one of the white program managers at this nonprofit. Oh, you're not doing this right. Can you take this and be careful with our resources? Be careful with our shovels. Oh no, you're not planting this right. Actually dug up my baby's plant that he planted for the first time and replanted it and showed him the right way to do it. And I don't mean the right way. I mean the white way, okay? People of color, historically, indigenous people, Black people, we have been here from day one. We are, one with the land. And the cognitive dissonance in the conservation and environmental field, where we look at even animals as less than, that we're superior than them. We're not. Animals are our brothers and sisters, and the earth is our mother. So why are we not acting as such? I can't tell you how many times I've been uncomfortable outside, trying to diversify our programs and bring in volunteers. Well, why don't BIPOC want to volunteer? Because they don't want to go out and pick blackberries and sweat and have no water and have no snacks and be tokenized and be told that they're doing it wrong and be one of maybe 2 or 3 people of color in the whole entire experience for the day. So when they leave, that volunteer experience wasn't fulfilling them. It did not connect them to nature because their mind was so preoccupied with microaggressions and safety and, oh, do I have to do this? And I'll end on the note of just being outside alone. Like having to navigate racism and closed spaces is one thing, but when you're outside and I have to constantly think, how racist is this area? Will I be safe? Will my son be safe? Will my dark-skinned partner be safe? Can we wear a mask? Like all of the questions we have to ask ourselves. Who will be there? Are we accepted? It's too much, and let alone the nonprofit sector, how out of pocket they are with the policies, and the denial, I think, is the blatant disrespect that we cannot continue to accept, because Mother Earth is on fire and she's talking back, and we see it right now. So the urgency has to happen over the intellectualization. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was, again, very powerful and very accurate. I mean, I believe that there's so many spaces that people of color need to be not just welcome to in the sense that, hey, you can come and join us, whatever it is, but really made space for, right? And made to feel like their values are important and their practices are important as well. Thank you so much. So I'd like to actually continue a little bit more on talking about the space in which we occupy. So as far as us in the professional educational world as people of color who also work in conservation or work in the outdoors. So let's focus a little more on conservation field as a profession and a field of study. So what are some of the ways that the field perpetuates inequities and the lack of diversity in the workforce or academia? And for the second part of that question is, how do we change or deconstruct these barriers? And I know that's a very tall order as a question, but maybe we can start the conversation. We can go back around again. Ursula, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. Well, one of the things that is pretty, it's like I think I mentioned already this, preconceptions or like, misconceptions and preconceived opinions about people are so prevalent. And it is just like, and it has affected me personally. In many cases, I needed to prove who I am, kind of try to say, oh, well, yeah, I have a PhD, or something, because people will just like make assumptions about me right away. And to be honest, I haven't feel that much personally in my own, bubbles probably. But when you get a little bit outside of the bubble, you feel much more like exposed to that. And then also another thing that is pretty important for me is that I probably cannot even speak from my own experience because maybe I'm the lucky ones. There is so many people in my community, and like Latin American and people who like suffer the consequences of these preconceptions of like, just, they will ask you right away, oh, so you came here illegally? Something like, it's just something that it just, and it as I mentioned before, it just gives you this, you have to kind of back up, and then you don't know how to respond. You feel like hearted, but you also say, well, no, I have to be strong about this and then stand for me. But as Chris and many other people say, you have to be constantly proving who you are if you don't have your comfortable bubble. And that, I think that is something that, that shouldn't be happening that way. The same way that I can speak as a Latin American Peruvian woman, then I also can speak as a woman. I mean, as a Latin American and as a woman. I've been told things in the field of conservation that you'll be like horrified. And in the presence of my students, in the presence of like other colleagues, like things like, oh yeah, you are an ornithologist because you wanted to find a boyfriend. Things, I mean, so, you know, so kind of like not even like so simple and so like what? And then I also been told, you know, things about like, oh yeah, what are you doing here? When you have a PhD, then talk to me. My ideas were not value because I was a woman and I didn't have a PhD. And then when you put that, it translates into like, you know, the communities who like, some of us have the opportunity, some of us are more privileged than others to being able to access an education. I was. And then in certain communities, and you know, I can relate to Peru, for example, in which even this racism pervades within a community that is within your community, and it turns into classism. If you have a little bit more of European ancestry, you're going to be regarded better compared to like an indigenous from the Andes or an indigenous from the Amazon, and their opinions are not going to be valued anymore. We're seeing, I can speak from Latin America, from Peru, how we're seeing like how Native people are dying because of their defending the rights to gold mining operations in the middle of their land. They're defending the line against oil exploration. We're seeing that in Colombia, in Ecuador, in Peru. We're seeing like lots of like people trying to defend their land, trying to defend their traditions, being just not considered at all. And then when it has the, you know, they don't have the opportunities. They say, well, yeah, they're not interested in this. They only, you know, they're hunting, they're doing this. We have to save the rainforest. It's like, wait, we had to save the rainforest for what reason? Only for, I mean, I love the animals, I love the forest, but how about the people, you know? And we all learn about this. When I was a young person, I would be like vouching for just the animals in the forest, but you learn that without people and you are part of it. So it's a lot of interconnections there. And I think that is so important to recognize. They hurt so much. They have hurted so much. Even as I can remember who was talking like right now about national parks and, you know, on John Muir and all this. How many national parks were created? And I love national parks, I support them, but how many of them were created in the lands of Native Americans and in the lands of Amazon and indigenous, or in the lands of all these different Native communities around the world that they have no word and they were eradicated from them? So how do we bring this and repair these damages? It's a very important thing. And I think there are ways. We're in a very slow process, but there are ways, and probably we're going to talk about that in a moment, but I'll leave it in there.
Thank you so much. Jasmine, how about you?
Yeah, I can't necessarily speak to being in like quote unquote the workforce, the environmental workforce, because I've always been outside of it. My focus was in research into the lack of diversity and representation within the environmental field. That's what my focus was when I was at the University of Washington studying environmental studies. And what I learned from doing these one-on-one interviews with leaders from various sectors of various identities, it was really clear that the approach comes from this quota system. So instead of like an inclusive space means that you're like, we're fully open and we're focused on equity. But when you're coming from this place of like, oh, we need more brown people, like, how do we get more? You know, it's like the question there is like already part of the problem. It's not about a quota, you know, it's about creating space for the leadership of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And within academia, it's like we don't see a lot of people of color in studying environmental studies in academia because, I mean, it wasn't built for us. And so already it doesn't feel like I'm invited here or welcome here. And like in my own culture and from where I come from, we're already connected to the land. What I'm trying to do is like survive in this country and like make enough money to just live. And so I don't think that studying soil science is going to help me make enough money to live, but I'll make time to enjoy and walk carefully on the earth in my own time. You know, it's very complex. Yeah, specifically trying to break that barrier of like being hireable. Like I go to school to become more hireable. That's why I need a degree. And so studying environment is often not on the docket necessarily because it's not going to help me get hired.
And that makes a lot of sense. I mean, a lot of communities of color, BIPOC communities, have to focus on other immediate needs, right? And that's due to a lot of reasons, including just generations and generations of systemic racism that prevent us from even thinking about being part of these conversations or careers or education programs. Aaron.
Yeah, so I have not experienced any racism or exclusion, as I think the only not person of color on the panel. But what I have observed in a lot of detail is what I think Ursula and many of the panelists have described as just lack of recognition of local and traditional knowledge. The scenario that I saw every day was university-trained scientists in positions of authority in parks, in environmental agencies, telling local and indigenous communities that live on the land that have sophisticated agroecological or silviculture systems that, no, you're not abiding by our regulations, or no, what you're doing is illegal. My judgment on that is a lot of it is just brutal, direct racism. It's just a very brute force racism against indigenous communities. And I think there's so much potential to empower indigenous and local communities with technology, with training, with really interesting co-management schemes where these communities are the ones running the protected areas or the sort of conservation spaces. And they're on the upside, there are some examples that I've been fortunate to be a part of where local indigenous communities really were empowered to run protected areas, to even create carbon market programs and generate incomes for their communities and create community businesses like sustainable furniture through the revenues and through the education opportunities that came from that first effort to cross the divide and empower local indigenous communities.
I mean, that's great that you actually have examples, and so we know that it can be done. It's not impossible, and we have great examples to follow. Cassie, what about you? What do you think on this topic?
Well, I have so many thoughts on this. I think when I think about specifically the environmental education realm, I think back to a job that I had where my actual title was Urban Programs Educator, where I was one of 2 out of 20 educators, so 2 BIPOC staff out of 20. And then majority of the students that we were serving actually were not from communities of color. And so how are we as organizations, and I guess in my specific example, how are we as nonprofits thinking about like who we're trying to serve and how can we break down those barriers? I saw someone in the chat box ask, about how, hiring more BIPOC staff. And I think before you even ask that question, you have to think about the space that you're welcoming them into. Is this a place where they feel welcomed and feel included and their voices are heard? Are you addressing those white norms that are currently being perpetuated within your organization? Are you addressing the white supremacy that is at the root of where your organization started, most likely a historically white-led place, and now it's, you know, potentially currently white-led? You know, how are you addressing that so that when they do come on, they can feel comfortable and be retained and do their job and you know, share their passion for the environment that they came there to do. And also just thinking about like barriers to access. Are you posting the salary range? Are you offering benefits, you know, as Jasmine alluded to, that allow for these BIPOC staff to live their lives? These are all things that just, you know, within our systems, we need to be questioning.
I think that's a really important point, that a lot of the, you know, career choices we make are dictated by our existing privilege, right? We can't just decide what we want to do. We have to think about where we are, where we came from, our own resources, and a lot of that time, that means it's limited. Thanks. Chris?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's good to share kind of like an anecdote that my grandparents once told me, is that like when our white colleagues and professionals, when they go into work, they could bring themselves. When we go into work, we bring our whole community, right? So we're bringing an entire community of experiences based off of the history of our country. And what does that mean specifically and operationally for how to get more people of color into conservation? That means actually creating strategies and policies that knock down all of what essentially is a system of privilege. So in conservation, oftentimes, if you want to get in the field, you need experience. Okay, so how do you get that experience? Through volunteer opportunities. All right, well, based off of the history of our country, many communities of color don't have the same amount of capital as many of our white contemporaries. So being able to get into that field is really hard. There are stigmas against actually getting into the field. So when you are an environmental scientist, when you are a conservation scientist in undergrad, you know, you may be one of 3 people of color. And that's one of 3 people of color of anybody who's not white. So maybe 1 Black person, 1 person who is East Asian, and 1 person who is Dominican. That literally has happened to me when I was in college at Columbia, right? And the higher you go up in that echelon, I'm sure y'all have heard of the leaky pipeline. It gets leakier and leakier and leakier because you have to do more and more volunteer opportunities. You have to buy equipment and then get reimbursed for it. But you don't get reimbursed for it until a month or 2 months or 3 months later. If you don't have that economic capital, how are you going to get reimbursed to do the research that you are called to do? And then, of course, the burden of doing the research and doing it well is put on you to say, oh, I'm so disappointed that you didn't do this correctly. Well, here were all of these barriers. Again, entire community I had to bring into work, whereas you could just worry about the science. And that's all you have to worry about is the science. We have to worry about everything else, including and not limited to, and Jasmine, I love the fact that you brought up intersectionality, the idea of just being out in the field. I always go with somebody out into the field because I am terrified of the police. I've done this work for decades and I still go out in the field with people. This is something that we think about all of the time. And these are the stories that have been unheard. Very similar to, and just really briefly here, the story of where is safety? So way back before and after World War II, y'all may have heard of the Green Book, right? So the Green Book was established to help African Americans navigate where the safe and unsafe places were in the country. Many of those places had, say, for instance, these sundown towns where you couldn't have a Black person in that town when the sun went down, or they would chase you and lynch you. So that, even though we don't necessarily have a verifiable Green Book right now, I feel like is something that certainly can be said in the country today, because we're living in times where there are areas that are not safe for us to be. And in conservation, you are expected to be in these wild lands. That's something very fundamental to the science that we have to address.
That's a great point, Chris. Thank you. I think that the point that we bring our communities, we bring our history, we bring our own daily microaggression experiences, we bring so much more than just the person that we are. And that makes it so much harder to be successful. Latasha?
Yeah, thank you all. Just, it's so heavy. I mean, my heart is literally about to jump out of my chest because it does hit so close to home. You know, we can't talk about this without getting emotional, worked up. Yeah, just thinking of all the experiences that perpetuated this. You know, for me in Seattle Works, I teach a bridge board training. So we offer it free for people of color to take the training in our efforts to diversify nonprofit boards. And so I'm trying to just do that, get more BIPOC at the table so that we are making decisions for our communities. And if you can get on a public board where maybe your voice is going to be the voice that's heard, you know, so they don't put that factory or that biochemical plant in your neighborhood or your community of color because nobody showed up or nobody made a noise. We have to get diverse representation at the forefront of this. And that starts at the board of directors, it starts in community meetings, leadership positions, everything. And so, and also taking the leadership of the indigenous folks. Like, why are we not centering land acknowledgements, using that as an opportunity to raise awareness to the many, many, many struggles that the indigenous people are facing, let alone, you know, just the blatant racism that we're all experiencing. And just thinking about, I see our guest is here, so I'll wrap it up, but just thinking about what everybody shared. How can we feel safe outside? How can we talk about, you know, educating the white kids and educating us white environmental, you know, teachers? You know, I'm sorry, I don't have sympathy for you because we're too busy trying to survive and stay alive. And so that's on you. That's your work to do. This is what we did. We came to a panel, we showed up, we showed out, we told you our stories, we told you our pain. Now you take it and you run with it and you start an equity group and you implement that and make the culture reflective as to what your priorities are. And it has to come with the corresponding level of time and money. It just does.
Thank you so much. No, I think it just kind of outlines that there's space for a lot of other people to get involved. It's not just our responsibility as people of color or Black or Indigenous people. It's responsibility of our colleagues and to help us and help their communities and their work become better with our participation and inclusion. Okay, so thank you so much to the panelists. That was really insightful and amazing conversation. It is a little over 6:40, and we have a special guest here. And honestly, this is just so that we can take a little breather, and we'll come back to an audience question. But just as a reminder for why we do what we do and why we have this passion for conservation. So, is it Janelle, Rachel? Are you guys ready? Who do you have with you?
Hi, I have Cisco, our Harris's hawk, with us tonight. Cisco is one of the elder statesmen here at the Raptor Center. He's been flying with us since 1989, and he's 32 years old this year, so he is an older gentleman. And Harris hawks are not a hawk that we'd find here in the Pacific Northwest, but if you were in the Southwest United States, south into Central America, you might be able to find Harris hawks flying in the desert. So as a hawk, he is a bird that hunts and eats other birds. And so they have some really awesome adaptations to help them do that. They have some really fabulous feet. So they're hunters that use their feet instead of their beak to hunt. And so they have very strong, powerful feet and toes and very sharp talons, those toenails. They have a sharply hooked upper beak, which helps them rip their food into smaller pieces. And they have forward-facing eyes. So they see a lot like we do. They have really good depth perception. And they also see in very fine detail at great distances. So Cisco is using his eyesight right now to look for the rabbits that are calling the Raptor Wildlife Theater home this time of year. And he's scouting out some rabbits tonight. He's not gonna get to hunt them, but he's definitely looking for them. And Cisco's been flying here with us for a really long time. He's a wonderful, wonderful teammate for us to have.
Guess we lost volume there.
Oh, sorry.
There we go. Yeah.
We're back. We're back.
Yep, we're back.
Wonderful.
Yep.
he's doing a lot of these sorts of programs where he's able to visit everyone over conference calls like this on the internet, where we can give people an up close, slightly different perspective of Cisco. You can't go hunt the bunnies. We're not doing that tonight. It's not. Sorry, it's not happening tonight. Some snacks. So Cisco's eating dinner, just like we might be very soon. But his menu is a little different. Here at the zoo, Cisco and our raptor squad are eating rodents, whole prey rodents, so they get mice and rats. He likes quail, and he's a good eater. So I don't want to share his meal with him, but he does enjoy all of his snacks. Right, Bird?
Great. Anything else we can share about Cisco?
Oh, there's like so many things we could go on forever. I'm trying to be careful so I don't get on a roll and really start talking and taking up all the evening, because it's not really about me or Cisco. You guys are having a wonderful conversation, and we're so excited to be a part of the discussion tonight, even as a bit of a lighthearted piece of it. No, Cisco's just great. He's an older boy, and so he's looking a little disheveled tonight because he's molting. This is the time of year where birds are starting to get ready for their seasonal flights if they're migrating. So here in the Pacific Northwest, we are gearing up to see a lot of our birds that might call our region home during the summer to raise their families. They're getting ready to head south for the winter. So where we don't have Harris hawks, we do have birds like vultures, turkey vultures, and osprey that just visit for the summer, and then they head south. I don't know if you guys can hear the airplanes. Airplanes are here. We're outside. We're at the zoo. This is what happens.
Well, thank you so much. It's honestly a privilege to have you here and to be part of this, and just a reminder of the work we do and why we do it, for that beautiful face right there. Thank you. Okay, so if we're ready, take a deep breath, kind of go back to our topic, but maybe on a little bit of a lighter note, and say that we're going to take some audience questions. And we got a ton of questions, and it was really hard to choose. And of course, only within an hour, we don't have a ton of time to talk, but we chose one in particular that hopefully will put us in a direction of action and hopefulness. So Latasha, I'd love to start with you since you were cut short a little bit. So the question is, what is your motivation for your work for saving the planet? And what do you care about most about in your work? Yeah, is that?
Perfect. Yeah, thank you for this opportunity. This right here, this is what I care about the most: awareness, education, and connection. And so I connected with all of you panelists here. I just feel a piece of my heart in all of you, and I will continue to do this. And hopefully one day my son and I can go outside and not have to look over our shoulder. The urgency of the planet, I mean, they say we have less than 10 years before a lot of these damages we're doing will become irreversible. So I use that, I guess, as a sort of internal urgency clock of like, every day matters, every panel matters. I don't care if there's 210 people on this panel and one person gets something from this, then I can sleep, you know? So we can do what we can, and that's what's gonna keep me going forward. The fire to fuel, to keep burning and burning.
That's great. Thank you so much. Ursula, what about you?
There you go. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that motivate me, but I think like first than anything is like to be thankful to this planet and to this Mother Earth that first of all provides me with life and provides with life to the people I love, to the things that I love, to the communities that I love. And the other thing is that I just, it motivates me because I want to be humble. I don't want to be like a savior. We've been talking about that, right? It's just, I want to be engaged with nature. And I want that those feelings that I have every time I'm either here in the Pacific Northwest, teaching my students in the middle of the field, that fascination is passed to like more people with that freedom to feel that fascination, that not being afraid, not being needed to excuse yourself for anything. And then just seeing so many young people, so many of my students have that passion, so many, you know, I'm so lucky that I work at UW Bothell, in which like the classrooms, I hope one of you, if you guys come, the classrooms have all the colors and all the denominations you want to call, all those different perspectives, like, you know, from different kinds of people, from different kinds of stories. And just being part of it gives me a lot of hope. It gives me a lot of hope to just see that they can have those opportunities. I want to work hard to make those safest spaces that inspire people. And the somehow that, you know, kind of giving back, because I was one of those few fortunates who have somehow a little bit more safer space. So why don't you give it back to the community, give the voice to the Native people in Peru, in here, right? Give that vote. And I'm gonna, you know, work for that until the last day of my life, if I can do it, and fight for the voice of everybody, the voice of the forest, that it comes in so many ways. It comes from people, it comes from the animals, it comes from the plants, but we can do it together, being humble and starting from the same common ground without this, you know, this making assumptions about the other, trying to help others. That's not the idea. The idea is to start from the same ground all together with, and it may sound idealistic, but those who feel in this privilege, and at some levels, I would say so many levels. When I'm from Peru, I feel so privileged that I'm in the kind of in a different level in there, that we all be at the same common ground with all of our vulnerabilities, with all our fears, and then just kind of work together, understand each other. And again, it may sound idealistic, but I have hopes, and that's something that I can just try to move on, but without never turning my back to those who don't have that voice. So that's what it motivates me. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's idealistic at all. I think you have to be, when you're facing so many barriers and restrictions and violence and poverty and everything, when you face so many barriers, you have to be idealistic to keep going. Jasmine, what motivates you to keep going?
Thank you for that. That was beautiful. Specifically, I am really like building something new. I've always felt like I'm building something that people haven't really done before. Or when I find people who are also working in this space of like trying to tie things together that wouldn't necessarily go together, like movement and anti-oppression work, for example, or like it's that weaving together of things that might not otherwise make sense. I'm really inspired by seeing change and transformation happen within people when I can facilitate that kind of space. I've just started to do like facilitation with leaders specifically because they're the ones who change the culture of their organizations. And so when you can have like deep emotional transformation, that's when you start to see change really occur. And so even just like a teeny tiny moment like with another person, that's what drives me. And like just feeling like I'm part of the earth at all times, you know, like realizing that I'm made of the same stuff, like that always helps me to stay connected and stay inspired, even though I might be in a lot of pain or I might be feeling a lot of fear, you know. I just follow the intuition.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, I think trusting our intuition is something we forget about or that we question. And that's an amazing point, that just to remember that that's kind of your guiding star. Aaron, how about you?
Thanks so much, Jasmine and Ursula. It's beautiful and moving. My initial motivation to do conservation work and social justice work comes from my grandparents being raised on their stories of being excluded. My grandmother used to tell me about walking around and seeing signs that said no Jews or dogs allowed in restaurants and at public spaces. And that it was my role to fight for equity and fight for inclusion, and that's the spark and the continuing torch behind most of my work. And I think the motivation, the things that sustain motivation over many failures and losses and pain and tragedy are the few success stories. I'm very proud to have played a small part in connecting indigenous unions from Central America with groups in Indonesia and Southeast Asia and Africa to help contribute to global climate policy conversations. And yeah, it's 10 years of work to make a tiny contribution to a very huge and very slow moving effort to try to stop the planet from overheating and creating chaos like we're seeing today with sort of hurricanes in Louisiana and relocations of people down there. So a few, the success stories, I guess, keep me motivated.
Great, those are very important, I think, to keep all of us going. Cassie, what motivates you?
Thank you, everybody who's shared about their motivation so far. I think my previous experiences have been motivating me. I kind of alluded to experiencing some microaggressions, gaslighting and blatant racism within the environmental nonprofit sector with my prior positions. And, I think for any BIPOC who are on this call right now, like you need to determine how much you can take. There's only so much of that you can take without sacrificing your own mental health. And so sometimes you need to make a change, and that is what I decided. So, I'm not currently within the conservation or environmental realm right now, but I am at an organization where I am making an impact within the nonprofit sector in terms of helping other organizations to decolonize their workspaces, to create those welcoming spaces for BIPOC, and for leadership to understand how to embrace everybody's intersectionalities and their multitudes.
Great, thank you. Chris, are you up for wrapping us up with your motivations?
Yeah, I'll be very simple in just saying that it's this community right here. This is the hope, right? This community right here that pretty much gasses me up when I'm tired, when I only get 3 hours of sleep because I'm prepping a lecture or watching my kids because they threw up the other day. The fact that I have such a great community of students to learn from constantly, that I have a 2- and 4-year-old that teach me every day how to value the land, that they know the connections between animals and plants, that my 4-year-old son who has a tomato garden, strawberry patch, blueberries, pumpkins, corn, will go out every day and tell me, Daddy, the tomatoes, they're green today, but when they turn yellow, they'll be red in 2 days and we can pluck them. The fact that he has that knowledge at 4, the ability to really understand and value the land in ways that I hope does not get beat out of him because he's told that he doesn't belong in that space. I fight for that. I fight for their belonging in that space. I fight for all that belonging in that space. And, if I can, make a Hamilton reference, like history has its eyes on us, right? We have the tools. That's the hope, is we actually already have the tools. We already know what to do. And now it's time to do the fighting. Now it's time to do the voting. Now it's time to actually do the mobilization, because there are some people that aren't going to get it. There are some people that aren't going to want to be part of that community, and that's okay. But there are a lot more that do. And I can't stop that fight. I can't, because y'all are my community. It is my job. I feel like I was called to this earth to do so, and I will continue to do it until my last breath.
Thank you so much. No, I have to agree that this discussion alone is such a healing place to be. It's recharging. It's, we go back and we read the news and we live our everyday lives and we kind of see our struggles. Oh, there he is. Hi, buddy. Oh my God. But, I think that's really important, that this community, that we connect with each other, that we talk to each other, and we share our joys. So, oh, there's another buddy. Oh my God. So sweet.
This
Thank
is Dakari, and he's a dinosaur today.
Oh yeah. See that? Oh my gosh. Thank you so much, all of you. Sadly, we've just run out of time. And thank you for your incredible insights. Oh, sorry. I lost my little notes. Oh. Okay, so I wanted to thank UW and Network for Nature for hosting this event. And to support these programs, just follow the links in the chat. Molly's been putting them up. Thank you. And you can become a Network for Nature member with a donation of any amount. So there's a very low barrier to getting to be part of this amazing network. Not only do you get great content, but then you also get to connect with other people who love nature and love wildlife. And you don't need to be a conservation professional to join. Thank you to all the participants and for joining us tonight. Thank you so much for being here. Keep an eye on your inbox for a follow-up email with some questions answered and a link to the recording of the event. And thank you and have a good night.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you a ton, friends.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Put that one.
Go ahead, man.
Put that one.
On you. I am not throwing away my shot.
Right? So good. It's so good. Or do you want to say hi?
Hi.
Hold the phone, baby. Were the panels staying on? Were we staying on for a little bit? Is everybody
We can
done?
stay. Yes, we can stay. I'm just waiting for all our attendees to have the chance to disconnect. So if you can give us maybe just 2 minutes.
Cool, yeah.
But thank you so much, really. Yeah, perfect. Sorry, I had to remove everyone manually. But thank you so much. No, this was amazing. I saw a lot of great comments in the chat box. I will save those and also send it to you with the link of the video so you can also look at it. I know it's difficult when you're in the panel. Molly, I don't know if you want to add anything else.
I was just going to say there was 3 questions that I didn't answer because I'm not qualified to. So I'll put them in that Google Doc that I mentioned where we pulled a few others. So if anything, when I send that to you, strikes your fancy as something you want to reply to, just go ahead and type it right into the Google Doc and I will compile them in the email that we send out next week. So I'll send that in the morning and then you'll see a couple more updates from us probably, and then your checks